Okay, hi everyone. I think we're about ready to start. Krista and Shibayan, thank you so much for joining us in Zoom. We had a bit of a crisis ourselves with the fact that Blue Jeans didn't function properly for us on Facebook Live, so we have had to shift back to Zoom. So thank you so much for joining. Welcome everybody else who is joining us today via Facebook Live. This is our second Tibet climate crisis talk. And we are delighted to be able to do this today, which is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. There are events going on online, obviously, around the world, and we're really, really pleased to see so many Tibet groups and Tibet supporters taking lots of different actions today. I'm not going to moderate today. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Lobsang. But before I do that, I just wanted to really quickly reiterate what I said last week about us broadcasting via Zoom. We do take the security issues very seriously, and we don't have any internal conversations via the Zoom platform anymore. And we are very seriously looking at trying to move to another communication platform for public broadcast. But this is proving to be slightly more difficult than we had hoped. But by next week, we really should be on a different platform, hopefully Blue Jeans. So I'm going to hand over to Lobsang, who's going to introduce our panel to you today. And I hope we have a really good discussion. Lobsang.
Thank you, Mandy. Hi everyone, I'm Lobsang, and so today's topic of discussion is very important. And in our first talk of Tibet climate crisis, we discussed the natural disasters in Tibet and the problems and the solutions. And today, on the 50 years of Earth Day, we will be discussing human rights, climate crisis, the role of indigenous communities, and international climate negotiation. And so when we talk about environment and human rights, they are interdependent. And thus, states should ensure a very safe, clean, and healthy, sustainable environment in order to respect and protect and fulfill human rights. So with this, today's discussion, we have a very two interesting speaker, Kinzum Dungu and Simon, Dr. Simon. And hi, everyone, Kinzum and Simon.
Hi, Lobsang.
Hi. Kinzum is the Executive Officer of Australia Tibet Council and the Australian representative in the Tibetan Parliament in exile. Kinzum was also the co-author and alongside Simon and Gabriel of Australia Tibet Council's 2019 report called An Iron Fist in the Golden Glove. And Dr. Simon is an expert on the global climate crisis and has spent almost over a decade campaigning for climate justice in Tibet, Australia, and the Pacific. He was also the author of Australia Tibet Council's 2015 report, Environment and Tibet, an Environmental Challenge. In our today's discussion, we have basically two sessions. In the first session, I will be asking a few questions to our speakers. And in the second session, then viewers can ask questions and they can leave the questions in the comment box, and then I will read out the questions to our speakers. So my first question is to Dr. Simon. So when we talk about human rights, and then we also talk about rights of indigenous people, and then we often discuss rights of indigenous people and respecting and protecting their rights to the lands and the territories that they have been owned and occupied and also used. So can you please tell us the role that indigenous peoples and the local communities play in climate solutions? And second, what are some of the common challenges faced by the Tibetans and other frontline communities around the world?
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Lobsang. Thank you, Mandy, for this opportunity, and hi to everyone. Before I jump straight into that question, I'm going to start with a little tradition we have in Australia, which feels very pertinent given today's discussion, which is to just acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're speaking to you from. Australia, like Tibet, is stolen land for which sovereignty was never ceded. So we always begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, which in our case, we're Kinzamanaya, is the direct people of the Eora Nation, which is now this part of Australia, and paying our respects to the local elders, past and present. And just before I talk specifically about Tibet, maybe just speaking for one more moment as a Australian on this subject, as a lot of people would have seen, we had a truly horrific bushfire season, which only ended a few months ago, that saw enormous tracts of Australia go up in flames and more than a billion native animals perish. And one thing that really came to the fore through that experience, and of course has been known for a long time, is that Indigenous Australians, Aboriginal Australians, had very important ways of managing fire and of taking care of the Australian landscapes in ways that avoided these very dangerous fires and that preserved biodiversity and that enabled them to live sustainably. And I think for us here, that's one very clear example of just how important traditional knowledge and practices are in dealing with today's challenges. Here, it's particularly important around fire management. If we look at some of the world's great forest regions, the Amazon, the tropical forests of Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, it's often said, and there's very good evidence for this, that the best way to keep forests standing, to protect biodiversity, to preserve the carbon stores, is to ensure that there is rights for local Indigenous people, that they have control over their land and resources. And of course, it's precisely the same in Tibet, and in fact, perhaps clearer there than almost anywhere else, that if we want to protect the Tibetan Plateau, which, as I'm sure we'll get to, is such a crucially important part of the world for so many hundreds of millions of people, then one of the best ways to ensure that is to make sure that that traditional knowledge and wisdom that's built up over hundreds of generations is still able to be applied in decision-making, in the traditional way in which, in the ways in which Tibet is used. And of course, that's important not only for climate and environmental protection. You mentioned already that connection between human rights and dealing with climate change. It's also, of course, the right thing to do, and it's what enables people to have, dignified lives and to practice their culture and to be able to, live on their own terms. So we can see many examples around the world, and I think we'll talk in more detail in a later question about some of the particular distinctive aspects of traditional land management in Tibet and why they're very relevant today. But I think I'll leave it there for now. Oh, just on the common challenges, because I think we do need to identify these as well. It's very true in Tibet, as it is close to home here in Australia and the Pacific Islands and in a number of other places, that people who've contributed the very least to the causes of climate change are really being hit first and hardest. And perhaps we'll talk a bit more later about some of the specific changes happening in Tibet. So that's a challenge in itself, because people are dealing with very brutal impacts of climate change. Despite all that knowledge they hold, and don't necessarily find it easy to be included in decision-making, either at the local level or in international fora. So that's certainly a common challenge as well that we'll come back to. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. And so you talked about the cases of Aboriginals from Australia. And so my next question is to Kinzum. So when we compare that and when we look to Tibet, so Tibetan nomads are also the frontline communities who has been protecting the Tibet's environment for a really long. But right now, China has introduced a massive plan of almost like 3 million Tibetans they have been removed from the grassland. So what are the Chinese government's arguments to remove these nomads from their grassland? And the second, what are the new threats that Tibetan nomads face due to nomadic relocation?
So I realized I had not unmuted myself. So yes, first of all, I want to mention that 2020, this year, is a critical year for Tibetan nomads and for Tibet's environment. As you just mentioned, the forced displacement of nomads by the Chinese government over the past 2 decades. Now, this state-engineered destruction of the Tibetan traditional way of life can possibly become complete when China unveils this new system of national parks, across the Tibetan plateau, which can roughly cover 30% of the entire area of Tibet. Now we all know, everyone attending this webinar will know that how, Tibetan nomads have flourished on the grasslands for thousands of years. And, as you mentioned again, that a significant population of the Tibetan people have come from a nomadic background. So it's a big part of who we are as Tibetans. And now China is completely transforming the Tibetan landscape, completely transforming the social fabric of our society. And so what this means is that, by ending this nomadic pastoralism in Tibet can mean the end of the Tibetan collective food security. It can mean an end to a land ownership. It can, of course, mean an end to the traditional Tibetan mode of production. So, a once proud and resilient community has now been, reduced to second-class citizens in our own country. And ironically, China is doing that, in a year when they are hosting, of course, with the COVID-19, this conference has been postponed, but, China is hosting the UN Biodiversity Conference in the same year that China is launching this, huge national park system in Tibet. So China is actually doing this, all this, in the name of conservation, in the name of environmental protection, in the name of development. Of course, we can talk more about how these arguments, don't really stack on each other. And so of course, there's nothing wrong with national parks per se, but we should also understand, the darker side of China's national parks in Tibet, that it is a political exercise. And so, when China unleashes or unveils this new system, we should make sure that, the international community doesn't, jump and praise the Chinese government without really understanding the full picture. So I think, we have a big job in ensuring that the Tibetan nomads get a fair deal out of this new system. We have a big job to ensure that, Tibetan nomads who are protecting their land and their environment, for instance, Anya Sengta, as we all know, is going to face this trial in the next few days, ensuring that, these people, these voices are heard and their rights are protected. And I mean, as a Tibetan activist, I am worried that, this thing is happening inside Tibet and it's kind of sleeping under our radar.
Thank you, Kinzom. And I feel like you have raised a very important point over here, where saying that, in the name of conservation and in the name of protection of land, the states, they introduced so many policies, and that can completely destroy, someone's, the human food security, and also takes control of that. Whereas when we connect that with the nomads, where, from political point of view, what I feel is that the nomads, they have owned this land for centuries and centuries, and then they use the policy of environment conservation and protection. They remove that, and so from the political perspective, once the nomads are removed, the state gets control of the land, and people are controlled by, first the state gets control of the land and people are controlled by the states. So in this, my second question is to Simon, why decolonization and self-determination is very important when we talk about climate change, in response to the climate change.
Thanks, Lobsang. I think just to lead into this, I'll share a positive reflection, which is I think there's been a lot of progress made the last 2 or 3 years, and International Tibet Network's had a big hand in this, in bringing a lot of awareness to the importance of Tibet itself, to the global environment, to the climate crisis. I think, you know, these days we see articles in the New York Times, National Geographic, talking about the roof of the world, the third pole, the headwater of Asia's rivers, all these things that make Tibet so important. I think the next step that I think, you know, the movement's also getting better at, that we can keep getting better at, is then communicating why not just Tibet, but Tibetans and human rights and self-determination for Tibetans is so important in driving the solutions. Why decolonization is part of the solution in Tibet and elsewhere, which was what the question's about. I think, I mean, as you've already communicated very clearly, and I think Kinzum and I both already touched on, Tibetans hold a huge amount of knowledge on how to live sustainably on the roof of the world. It's been built up over hundreds of generations. And so not just victims of the climate crisis, but very much, you know, holding the knowledge on how to not only protect from further environmental degradation in Tibet, but also begin recovering from some of the damage that's been done. But of course, when they're still dealing with the legacy of invasion and historical injustice and ongoing oppression and hyper-surveillance in a very dangerous environment, are not able to do that. And, you know, it's a situation we see in a number of parts of the world, but it's probably perhaps more acute in Tibet than anywhere else. So I think we're only able to see those solutions that maybe we can come back to a bit in the next question, you know, really come to life, and Tibetans fulfill that potential again in looking after the Tibetan plateau environment sustainably, and with that have secure livelihoods and everything else, if we see that process of, you know, decolonization, freedom for Tibet, essentially, that's going to enable that, that's going to be good for Tibetans, good for Tibet's environments, and because of Tibet's environmental importance, therefore good for the wider world.
Thank you, Simon. And for me, I mean, personally, I find this is very interesting when we talk about climate change and then self-determination. And so what I feel is that whenever we look at the issue of Tibet, and so Tibet has been illegally occupied by the Chinese, it's a colonized country. And so with that, you know, as Kinzum earlier mentioned about the economic development, how in the name of economic development, they have brought economic development, and then that has destroyed environment, as well as they illegally occupy the whole land, hoping that, you know, there will be peace and stability in the region. But then when we think about how can the international community respond to the Tibet's environment, my fourth question is to Kinzum. When we look at the international community and then with the Tibet, and then we have a China, and then everyone talks about how China is powerful and how China plays a role in terms of economic relations, trade with its neighboring countries. So why do you think that international community should challenge the Chinese you know, plans or economic developments in Tibet?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, you know, if these plans, the Chinese government's plans in Tibet remain unchallenged, that's going to have serious implications, not just on the Tibetan people, but on the whole world. As we all know, the global, how important Tibet is to the global environment. And, we are already experiencing this with the coronavirus pandemic right now. A problem in Tibet is not just a Tibetan problem. A problem in China is not just a Chinese problem. It's going to affect, we live in an increasingly interdependent world. And so there are going to be serious ramifications for the entire world. So that's one thing. Tibet, as we all know, is the source of all the major rivers in Asia, upon which more than 1.5 billion people, depend on the rivers that come from Tibet. So, for that reason, it is important that international community challenges China on what it's doing in Tibet. And also, the arguments that are being put forward by the Chinese government, they don't stack up, and the Chinese government are giving putting forward few arguments why they are displacing, why they are removing the nomads from the grasslands. And of course, there are a few of them. Let's just kind of talk on three main key issues, or three main key arguments that the Chinese government is presenting on this issue. Number one is the degradation of the land, how the overgrazing by the nomads is causing the degradation of the Tibetan grasslands. Now, we don't really need to go too deep into that, because, as people who are already following the Tibet issue, they already know that, how there is a growing scientific body of research that the nomads' lifestyle, way of life is actually crucial to the health of the Tibetan ecosystem, the Tibetan grasslands. And the nomads, and as we have seen, they have lived on the grasslands for thousands of years. So this issue of land degradation, that's, it's not true. That's number one. Second thing the Chinese government is saying is that they are, trying to help elevate poverty in the nomadic community. Again, if you look at, as you and I know, the nomads feel that they are actually worse off when they are removed from the grasslands. For Tibetan nomads, they feel their lives are fulfilled. Their spiritual well-being is being taken care of. They live a highly self-sufficient life when they are free on the range. And it's only when they are removed from the grassland that they feel deprived. They feel stripped off from their livelihoods, uprooted from their land, from their ancestral land. And that's when they feel that they are worse off. And that's when they start facing all these social economic challenges in this alien new environment. And the third thing is biodiversity, which is a big thing for China these days. China has developed this new interest in protecting biodiversity, and now the question is, does it really necessitate the removal of nomads from the grasslands? Tibetan nomads have protected the grassland. They, as we know that, Tibet's grasslands is an important grassland. It's one of the most important grasslands in the world, and it is the nomads who have looked after the grasslands. It is the nomads, who have looked after the rivers, the rivers, some of the major rivers, the grasslands, they are located on the banks of these rivers. So basically, all these arguments that are putting forward by China, they are not stacking up, so they must be challenged. So yes, just to add to that, sorry, I just wanted to add one thought to that. The problem with this whole thing about protecting biodiversity is that when China unleashes unveils this new system of national parks in Tibet, it is very likely that a lot of international agencies will pat China on its back and say you're doing a good job. So we have to ensure that the international community doesn't get swayed by this green rhetoric that is coming from China. So yeah, I just wanted to add that point about China's green rhetoric and how we can actually call it China's green colonialism in Tibet.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very right. Where they invest lots of money, and there is lots of advertisement in the Chinese news medias who says that national parks are, like that protects the environment and people. And I feel that as you said, the green projects, where I see that as the Chinese policy of a beautification of Tibetan landscape, and then completely ignoring the ecosystem and the livelihood of the Tibetans. So my next question is to Simon, and why the protection of Tibet's environment and the billions of people who depend on it requires upholding the knowledge, culture, and the rights of Tibetans.
Thank you. Look, I can probably be quite brief here because I think, Kinzum has already provided much of the answer here very, very convincingly. So I don't want to restate all of that, but it maybe is just worth starting by reaffirming, and I know this is well known probably to most people during this conversation, but what happens in Tibet matters so much for the region and by extension the entire world. So we're talking about direct impacts upon Tibetans, but direct impacts upon the climate struggle more broadly, and the ability of people on all these populous countries downstream to be able to flourish and prosper. I think we know it's well known now, the importance of Tibet as the source of the rivers that run through almost all the major rivers of Asia. Also, its role in driving the Asian monsoon that perhaps even more people depend on for their sustenance. And it's also, and maybe this is slightly less known, a globally significant store of carbon in the land, just the same way the great forests are. There's a massive amount of carbon sequestered in the Tibetan grassland environment. And so for all these reasons, that role in the carbon cycle, that role in fresh water, it's very important. And as we've touched on, we've seen very rapid changes there, very sort of clumsy development projects, over-exploitation of the plateau that have caused all sorts of environmental degradation with all sorts of consequences for Tibetans and people in the region. And so why then does the protection of Tibet depend on upholding knowledge, culture, and rights of Tibetans? Well, I think Kinzum just explained very well. Tibetan nomads in particular, also small-scale Tibetan farmers, have been part of Tibet's ecosystem for a very long time, and of course have not just survived, but flourished sustainably over a long period. And it's that kind of symbiosis, I guess, between Tibetan nomads and farmers and the Tibetan environment at large that has protected that crucially important area, that sort of maintained that stability, has maintained that biodiversity, has ensured that it's remained an environment that Tibetans have been able to thrive on, but that also has helped protect the headwaters of those rivers, that store of carbon, everything else that we're now seeing being degraded. So I think it's obviously a point we keep circling back to, but it's really only, and you could apply the same argument in other parts of the world, by upholding and protecting that knowledge that's enabled that sustainability and the values that have underpinned it, and the practices of, in the case of Tibet, just sort of light, sustainable grazing, low impact, use of the plateau, and putting that decision-making back in the hands of Tibetans, or at least enabling them to be full participants in decisions about Tibet's future. And the other point to make, and we took quite a deep dive into this with the report last year, An Iron Fist in a Green Glove, that doesn't mean foregoing all the good things about modernity. That doesn't mean you can't have, the good healthcare and education and prosperity that we all want to have. You can have all those things. It's really about that freedom to be able to choose the components of your own life and to determine your own future, to be able to continue to look after your country and live sustainably. And because of Tibet's importance, the ability of Tibetans to do that is so much better for all the rest of us as well.
Thank you, Simon. So my next question is to Kinzum. So you earlier in your presentation, you talked about water conservation and the biodiversity, conservation and protection in Tibet. And then we have grassland degradations that is also, we see in Tibet. So how do you see that along with the tackling the global climate crisis? How do you see that, how can we say that, the protection of Tibet's biodiversity or the water conservation can go hand in hand with the tackling the, global climate crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. Biodiversity protection, development, human rights, all these things, they are not mutually exclusive from one another. In fact, they are mutually, reinforcing. And that applies not just to Tibet, or it applies to every place in the world. And especially in and of course, if you look at the history of environmental destruction or overconsumption, which has led to today's ecological crisis, you will see that, this environmental destruction has been accompanied by colonization, has been accompanied by forced displacement of people from their ancestral land. And so, and that has been playing out in Tibet. When we look at the climate crisis in Tibet, it's not just an environmental issue. It has to be understood in the political context. It has to be looked at through the lens of colonization. So human rights and development must indeed go hand in hand in Tibet. And of course, the first step towards ensuring that we have an ecologically sustainable and a socially equitable path in Tibet is ensuring that the rights of the Tibetan people, whose land and whose culture are under stake, are protected. And the good news is that actually when you are protecting the rights of the Tibetan people, you are also ensuring that the Tibetan environment is also protected. So yes, it is not a either or choice. These have to go hand in hand.
Thank you, Kinzum. And my final questions to both Kinzum and Simon is that we would be focusing on the international climate negotiations. And when we look at the international climate negotiation and then role of China in the international climate negotiation, so everyone has kind of this impression that, China is the leader of global climate negotiation. They take active, participation or active role. But an irony is that whatever, when we look inside Tibet, I mean, we don't see that the Chinese leadership in terms of environment protection in Tibet. For years and years, the Tibet's environment are degrading, and so much of, as Kinzo mentioned earlier, so much of economic development that has brought up, and that is causing environment destructions in Tibet. So like, Simon, drawing your experience of international climate negotiation, how, according to you, how can the Tibetans, they build a strategic alliance with the other, climate vulnerable people, or how the Tibetans can be part of the global movement for climate justice?
Sure. Look, I know Kinzum will talk directly to her experience at the most recent round of negotiations. She has rather more recent experience than I do. But look, I think we tend to think of the Tibetan situation as unique. And I mean, it is unique in many important respects. I think because of the sheer significance of Tibet, because of the level of enduring repression there and so forth. But that said, there are sadly a lot of commonalities with various other environmental struggles around the world, whether it's tribes people in the Amazon, whether it's in pretty much anywhere where you have authoritarian governments or a big legacy of colonization. People have to really fight to defend their land, to to ensure they can practice their culture and traditional livelihoods. And those fights can be very, very dangerous as globally a rise in the number of environmental defenders who disappeared and faced very severe consequences. Anyway, I don't want to dwell too much on that very dark stuff, because the point I wanted to make is there are actually a lot of natural allies that Tibetans have in many different parts of the world, who are facing this common challenge of having to fight to have control of their land, to be able to be part of the solutions, to be able to have also obviously their livelihoods and dignity. And one of the encouraging things in the last couple of rounds of climate negotiations, which well, can otherwise be a bit of a train wreck, but one of the positive trends is we've seen, I think, a much stronger Indigenous caucus, a much more organized block of these kinds of communities and movements who are not represented well by their governments, but who are able to band together and push together for climate justice. We would have seen it even more had the last COP been in Lima. I think when it was moved to Madrid, some of the presence we'd seen there from the Latin American Indigenous peoples didn't happen as much as it would. But it's a trend that we've seen, is a much stronger block and movements of united Indigenous peoples. And so I think the first thing is that Tibetans have so much to bring to that broader movement because of their particular situation. And I think so much also that can gain from being, and of course, yourself and others have been doing a lot of this work, but I think there's lots more that can be doing, all of us, to build those strategic alliances with the many human rights and environmental defenders around the world who face similar challenges. So that's one fairly obvious point. Another thing I think is worth considering at the moment, given this very peculiar moment in history we're in with the coronavirus crisis, is that we don't know exactly how this is going to play out for China, for the Chinese government. Of course, they're working very hard at the moment to control the story around it and to position themselves as, saviors of the world somehow. But it's quite possible that, the government will be weakened, not only reputationally, but in other ways, in how this affects global geopolitics, and maybe a bit of a retreat from the sort of globalization and dependence that a lot of countries have on China, which means we might have reached a sort of zenith in terms of China's stranglehold on some of these UN treaty bodies. Maybe we haven't, but I think that's another optimistic thing to think about, is that we're going to see some quite interesting shifts in the global sort of balance of power and these sort of geopolitical dynamics coming out of this period that we're in. We don't know how that's going to play out, but it's not necessarily going to work out well for the Chinese government. So it's possible that when we go into these next rounds of negotiations on climate change under the Paris Agreements or anything else, we might actually see China's ability to really dominate those diminished a little bit. And I think we will also continue to see a stronger popular movement, led not by countries and states, but led by united peoples around the world for climate justice in a broad sense, and that very much being led by First Peoples, by Indigenous peoples and young peoples. And of course, Tibetans are very much a part of that.
Thank you, Simon. And you raised a very important and very, I would say, the positive note of how, united indigenous people and how civil society can play important role in terms of climate change solutions. And then now my final question is to Kinzom. And so as I asked Simon regarding the international climate negotiation, and recently in COP25, you have also attended the UN Climate Change Summit in Spain, and you have also written, a bit of a report on that. And I was also I could also able to attend the COP meeting in France, and so my experience for that was, there is lots of scope, as Simon mentioned earlier, but sometimes, it's like a bit very disheartening for me personally, because when I went to talk about climate, so there are like very few people who know Tibet. So, and then everyone is so busy at that conference, and everyone has come to come there at the conference to share their environment challenges. And then when we go there and represent Tibet, where people have a really very limited knowledge where Tibet is, and when they say Tibet, they only think of His Holiness the Dalai Lama or either the Buddhism. But yeah, I mean, the Tibet groups in Paris also have worked hard, and but then, I mean, like Kinzom, like how was your experience, and can you please share us your experience with us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I had the exactly same feelings. So I share your sentiments wholly, how frustrating it is, to be not being able to, share our story, not getting our voices heard, and feeling this sense of despair and, frustration at the lack of opportunity. And but then, I returned from COP, this most recent COP, feeling that there is a lot of work for us that needs to be done, a lot of work for the Tibet movement, for the Tibetan people. And first of all, we have to understand that this campaign on the environment or the climate crisis, it's not a short-term campaign. The whole movement has to prepare for a long-term campaign, and we can't expect quick results. And if we expect that, the COP25 or the UN climate conference is the end all and the be all of our campaign, then we are going to come back feeling quite frustrated. So we have to go into that kind of a conference thinking that we are not going to achieve quick results, that this is part of a long-term campaign. And part of that long-term campaign is, investing in relationship building, investing in, building strategic alliances, as as we've talked about earlier. Simon talked about the importance of the growing strength, growing power of the indigenous caucus, the indigenous voices, people fighting for climate justice. So there is this huge kind of potential for us to build our relationship with these communities, with these indigenous communities who have come from a similar background of colonization, of having to deal with displacement, overconsumption, all that stuff. So it's about us being able to tell our story better. It's about us being able to find that intersection of climate change and human rights, and also, as you said, it was a huge conference. You feel a bit lost. So it's really about us, understanding the processes that are happening there, and it's not just showing up in COP, but also the months and years leading up to a significant international moment like that. So yes, basically it is, we have to be prepared. It's a big piece of work for the Tibet movement.
Thank you, Kinzom. So I think over here you raised a very important point where we can build like you were focusing about investing in strategic alliance with the indigenous communities, and then you were also saying that the campaign for environment or climate change is not a very short-term campaign. It should be a long-term campaign, and I think that's very important. That sometimes when we talk about environment, we want everything, the result in a very short term. So I think right now we have Tibet groups working on the campaign on climate change and environment issues, and I hope there will be more of Tibet groups and other groups joining with us and then bringing up the questions. So that's my question, and thank you, Simon and Kinzom. So now we have got so many questions over here, and I will be reading out a few questions, so my first question is to Kinzom. So here, I mean, we have one of the, the participant he says that we have seen an escalation of environment protests around the world. And I'm interested to know if Tibetans in Tibet are protesting about environment issues. And if so, then what happens to them?
Yes, definitely. First of all, it is, so encouraging to see this, growing movement, especially young people being involved in this movement, kind of leading the movement. And yes, absolutely, in Tibet, there has always been, resistance led by the Tibetan people, especially the nomads, fighting for their land, fighting to protect their environment. And the sad reality is that, Tibetans live in a highly repressive environment where people do not have the freedom to protest, and any act of, even an environmental activity, organizing to defend your own land and environment are treated as political activities, and which is why we have people, as we speak, people like Anya Sengta, a nomad and a community organizer who has protested against China's mining activities in Tibet, facing 7 years in prison as we speak. And just next week, he's going to face trial. And there has been a series of incidents over the last many years in Tibet where Tibetans have resisted against China's mining activities. Tibetans, we have a long history of protecting our land, especially the nomads. And if you look at the self-immolations in Tibet, a significant number of them are actually from a nomadic background. So there are many instances, and there are also many instances of, protests which have proven successful. Cases where nomads have been able to, where protests have led to, mining projects being cancelled. So things like that are happening. Unfortunately, again, because of the lack of information that is coming out, we don't get all the stories in the media, but there is definitely a lot of activity happening in the environment space. And it is very important, not just as protests, but also a lot of community-based initiatives that are happening inside Tibet, working to protect the local environment. So yes, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, that's very true. I mean, when we talk about human rights and then environment, as Kinzon said that, how the environmental protesters are treated by the Chinese government. So when we talk from the human rights perspective, I feel that, the environmental protesters, they should also be provided freedom of expression. They should be allowed to give a space where they can also raise their voices. And as Kinzum, you also mentioned earlier, how Tibetans are brutally treated by the government when they talk about environment issues in Tibet. And so the next question that we have is from Facebook. And I think I'll ask this to Simon, because earlier, you were talking about the coronavirus and how that will impact Chinese government's, global image, or how that will change the role of China in international climate change or international relations. So over here, one of our participants says, we are obviously all living in a new type of world and the coronavirus, and this appears to be impacting global trust in China. I would like to know if you think there is a window of opportunity to seek support from the international community to stop China's plundering of Tibet's and Tibet environment.
Well, I think we're going to see probably, and we're already seeing it, I think, greater scrutiny on China and questioning of, China's governance, ideology, activities, which is probably going to open a window of opportunity to pursue the whole spectrum of things that matter to the Tibet movements, including Tibet's environments and the displacement of nomads and so forth, all the issues we've been covering here. I think it's easy when dealing with such a challenging issue to be grasping for these seeds of optimism, because things don't always play out the way we expect. But What's interesting from where Kinton I am is that Australia has often been one of the countries least willing to. We have a lot of economic interdependence with China. We've not had very strong political leaders who are willing to, speak very publicly about China's failings, whether it's in Tibet around human rights or around environmental protection. But just the last few days, few weeks, we've seen some the sorts of comments from our political leaders here, including our foreign minister, which I haven't seen before. Really quite bolshy comments pointed at China, and which is interesting, and I think does signal that the number of countries, including the sort of big Western democracies, probably are going to be wanting to go after China a bit more on a few fronts, and that naturally should open up a window of opportunity, to be pursuing these issues we're talking about today around Tibet's environment and around rights for Tibet's nomads, among others. I hope, as I'm sure we all do.
And thank you, Simon. So the next question that we have, I think I'll ask this to Kinzo. So the next question is, what is the situation with the damming in Tibet? And I read recently about the Mekong drying up and this being linked to dams in Tibet. So is this true?
Yeah, so the damming situation is again one of the more serious issues that is facing the Tibetan people and the Tibetan land and our environment. And I'm sure they will. It is a big discussion, and I think I can't say I'm an expert on this issue per se, but of course. China, as it is, investing so much in developing infrastructure like the roads and the railways. Likewise, it is, building dams across the major Tibetan rivers, which is having serious consequences, not just on the local Tibetan environment and the Tibetan people, because it means replacing, the local population, the local people from the land. But also having serious consequences on the billions of people living in the downstream countries. For instance, the Mekong example that you just cited, it's something that we have always talked about, how China's control over Tibet's rivers and Tibet's water resource can cause significant geopolitical issues, and it is already doing that. As we have just recently seen this new study about how the drought in Southeast Asia is actually a direct result of the damming that China is, doing along the Tibetan rivers. So yes, I would be really keen to have a separate webinar on this, the implications and the full extent of China's damming project in Tibet.
One thing I might add, if I may, and unfortunately is a bit of a counterbalance to the sort of optimistic note about opportunities that might emerge out of the awful thing that is the coronavirus crisis, is that it's also possible that China, since it's taken an economic hit, is going to want to start doubling down again on a lot of big infrastructure, potentially resource projects, damming, fossil fuel projects, and so on, as a means to start kickstarting its economy. Of course, it has all sorts of other opportunities through renewable energy and environmentally sustainable solutions, but it might be that we see some moves back in that direction as well. And it also might be that there's less scrutiny on that because the world's still very preoccupied with COVID-19. So the risk of a lot of bad stuff happening under the radar. So it's certainly a time when we have to be very vigilant about, new projects, and including hydroelectric dams.
Thank you. And the next question, I think I would ask this to Simon. And here it says, I know that the Tibetan Plateau is vital for carbon capture. Can you explain to me some more about how this works and why Tibet is so important when it talks about carbon capture?
When I was lucky to visit Tibet some years ago now, one thing that struck me was how intensely green a lot of the areas I was able to visit were. Certainly in the east, I mean, there's very lush forest. A lot of Tibet is, more grassland and shrubland, and then some of it is very arid alpine desert. But it's, as you three would know better than I, but it is, among other things, one of the systems, and grasslands like forests, like mangroves, are natural stores of a lot of carbon in the soil and in the vegetation. And as I think we touched on, the traditional modes of nomadic grazing and small-scale farming were very important in maintaining that. The cycle of grazing, which wasn't degrading the landscape, it was actually, maintaining not only the biodiversity, but that rich store of carbon. And then the whole series of policy mistakes we've seen really over the last, since the invasion of Tibet, has led to a lot of that being degraded. And that then sets up some of these vicious cycles that we're all aware of when it comes to climate, where you start releasing that carbon from the soil, from the grasslands in this case, because they're being overgrazed or eroded or exploited in different ways. And then you're fueling more warming, which is then driving further changes, the melting and drying of the plateau. But I think the thing we always want to stress in these conversations is that there's then a potentially a role, if people have secure land tenure and everything else, to be going through that slow process of restoring ecosystems and beginning to draw carbon back down from the atmosphere through restoring grasslands. We talk about that a lot in Australia, about how we can rehabilitate a lot of the land lost to bushfires. And there's nobody better place to do that than Tibetans in Tibet. And potentially there's sources of new livelihood and income streams and everything else there through, carbon markets and payment for eco services. But these are all the things that are just not being realized given the political situation in Tibet.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And so when we talk about carbon capture, I think permafrost also plays a very important role in terms of, the capturing the carbon dioxide. And so in Tibet, with the rise of temperature, we have seen, the permafrost degrading, and so that also will have a major impact. And I think the large, the roads of the railway lines are built on the permafrost, and there has been lots of news saying that, that will have building a railway line, the Lhasa-Kormo railway line building on the permafrost will have a huge negative impact to the environment as such. So I think the next question that we have, I think I'll ask to Kinzum. So it says, I heard you talked about the parks in Tibet. What does that really means, and how can we do to help stop them if they are not helping Tibetans?
So what it means is that, in Tibet, as of now, China has already designated many areas of Tibet as protected areas, in the form of nature reserves or in the form of UNESCO World Heritage listed properties. So there are many areas that are already labeled under, given different labels, all in the name of, protecting the Tibetan environment. So under this new national park system, a lot of these, protected areas will be regrouped or rebranded or upgraded to this new standard of national parks. Likewise, a lot of other areas or other, other areas will be redrawn and kind of incorporated under this new system. Now, as I said earlier, of course, national parks in principle, they are good. They are meant to protect, our environment, to help us protect our biodiversity. But in China or in Tibet, the problem is China's national park in Tibet has a darker side, which is it includes removing the people, the very same people from the land, the very same people who have looked after the land, so that could possibly, basically, finish China's project of displacing Tibet's nomads from the Tibetan plateau. So, sorry, that was the Siri talking to me. Somehow Siri thought I was giving the Siri some commands, sorry about that. so, under this national park, so what will happen to the national park? So this is a serious issue. China is basically, taking ownership of this Tibetan land, Tibetan landscape, this beautiful grassland, huge, expanse of the Tibetan plateau, and possibly, repurposing it to attract mass tourism. So the danger is Tibet will further become a more attractive destination for the rising middle class Chinese population, who will come to Tibet, who will have no respect for the local culture, who will trivialize Tibetan culture. And tourism, as we know, is problematic. China's tourism in Tibet is problematic. China doesn't allow international tourists to visit Tibet, but it allows its own citizens to, go to Tibet and, see this kind of sanitized version of Tibet. China's tourism in Tibet is focused on scenic spots. They are not focused on, having real interaction with the local people and understanding the real culture. It's either based on these, monasteries or, or on these scenic spots. So basically these will become a bigger tourist destination for the rising middle class in Tibet, in China. And so that's problematic. And the Tibetan people, the nomads who are displaced from them, the Chinese government is promising that many of them will get employment. Yes, as we can see from one of the main, the national park, there have been people who have got jobs to work in the national parks. But again, as we can see in every other industry or every other sector in Tibet, it's the Tibetans who are taking the lower ranks of this new, industry. The Chinese are taking on the higher, positions. And so basically, the main problem is that, why should the national parks necessitate the removal? If it is about really protecting biodiversity, it's the Tibetan people who have looked about our environment. It's the nomads who have looked about the Tibetan people. The Tibetan nomads, their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, their local knowledge should be respected and should be incorporated into this new system. So our job is to ensure that these nomads get a fair deal, that their local knowledge, their traditional knowledge is respected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you raise a really important question about the role of Tibetan nomads and what happens when they are removed. And sometimes it seems like a big promise, and then in reality, that doesn't really serve the purpose of Tibetans. And when we say about economic development, so normally many people ask the development for who is benefiting from this development. And I think this is very important discussions. And I think Kinzum, I realize that you have raised lots of issues on Tibetan nomads, and I think maybe in future we can have a specific webinar talking about nomads relocation, how that impacts on grassland, and how that changes the livelihoods of nomads. And so we have another question from Facebook. I think I'll ask to Simon. What are your thoughts on shifting narrative from Tibetan Plateau as the third pole to the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, which is now also identified as third pole? Does the new narrative affect us, or could it lead to our advantage?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think the probably campaigner in me thinks that, simplicity in communications is important. And a lot, I think, of progress has been made in, really cementing the notion of Tibet as the third pole, and, using Tibet in a pretty expansive sense. Arguably, it could be more accurate to talk about the Hindu Kush Himalaya. I think perhaps we can talk about both. I think, a big sort of shift in narrative when you're partway through really trying to sort of bring awareness to something can be a little bit tricky. I can't say I have a strong view on that, and I think it's probably one that needs to be decided by people from Tibet and from the broader region, how they want things to be termed, rather than being a question for a observer like myself. So certainly interested in any thoughts looking at that one.
Yeah, and even like our Tibet Network's Facebook page is called Tibet Third Pole. And yeah, I mean Tibetan. Some people, I think, when I was studying at university, it's like very interesting to say when we were talking about Tibet. And then while I was doing presentation on Tibetan Plateau, so one of the professor asked me saying that why are you calling Tibetan Plateau? Why can't you just call Tibet as according to the Chinese, where they call Tibet as Tibet to the Tibet Autonomous Region. So even and sometimes in the universities, we get restrictions, and sometimes the professors, they ask us to not call Tibet as Tibetan Plateau, but then China's Tibet or Tibet Autonomous Region. So it's so many challenges that we face nowadays, even in the so-called free country. So the next question that we have is from Facebook, and Kinzum, you were talking about the Tibetans' participation in UN climate change. So here the question says, I understand that Tibetans and groups are working to get Tibet raised at the COP meetings, but is there any actual, action from the UN on Tibet's environment?
Yeah, on that, I mean, the exact nature of these COP conferences, I would like to ask Simon to shed more light on that. What exactly does COP does? But like any UN institution, it is very important. These are these institutions, international institutions, where countries from all around the world are coming together to address the major challenges of our time. And it's so important that when Tibet is on the forefront of the global climate crisis, it's important that our voices are heard at the UN, at the UN climate conference. And the sad reality right now is that we are not represented. Our voices are not heard, and that's what we are trying to do. Go there, trying to find every opportunity to get our voices heard, try to build these alliances with the various communities who are attending these conferences. So these are significant, but as I said earlier, there is a lot of work for us. But on the exact nature of what it can potentially do for Tibet, I would like to ask Simon to, if you can say a bit more on that, Simon.
Well, we've been talking a bit about this between us, because I know it is one of the key aims of the campaign work this year. And there certainly are ways in which could get Tibet raised by a Tibetan in a much more kind of central and powerful way in at a COP or in another UN climate negotiation. Because although it is essentially a negotiation between parties or countries, I mean, sometimes we talk about the UN as a sort of entity in itself, but really it is just, a collection of all the countries in the world. But then you also have, various observer organizations who are able to participate in various ways, including within the actual plenary formal negotiations. So I think doing it through one of those observer organizations, and that would take a lot of the groundwork that Kinzum's talking about, over the months, years leading up to a big COP, to be sort of working one's way in there and sort of campaigning successfully for this to be something that really needs to be raised through that, whatever slots are available to observers, but that's certainly possible. The other, I think, is to work with one of the, I guess, like-minded governments, countries that have a major stake in what happens in Tibet. And, certainly no reason why a Tibetan representative couldn't be part of another country delegation. I don't know if that's happened in the past, it may have done. you're then having to deal with the sort of dynamics we touched on of, the influence of China within these, within any kind of UN process. And I think especially within the climate negotiations, where all the climate vulnerable countries and countries of the global south are actually grouped together in a group of 77 plus China. And so, a country would essentially have to break from that block if it really wanted to sort of push hard on Tibetan issues. I mean, I think nothing is impossible, but I think, as Kinzum says, understanding the process and the dynamics and figuring out the opportunities we have to really bring focus not just onto Tibet and its importance, but onto everything we've talked about today about the importance of rights and self-determination for Tibetans and all indigenous peoples being part of the solution. It's possible, but I think we've got to think about it quite creatively. But it's certainly possible. I think the other point just to mention there, and I think you Kinza mentioned this, is that we don't get too myopically focused on the UN process. It's an important part of tackling climate change, which requires a global solution, but I think arguably, for better or worse, we're seeing the sort of whole global rules-based order change and diminish a little bit, and perhaps ongoing, these UN processes may not be as important as in the past. They certainly will remain important, but there are all sorts of opportunities and levers we have outside of UN processes as well when we come to tackling these issues. It's a fairly long answer. I hope that's been of some use.
No, thank you. Thank you. And it's almost like midnight to Kinzum and Simon right now. So we'll be just taking two last questions, and I would, so any of you can ask. The first question is regarding, will the Belt and Road Initiative go through Tibet, and will it affect the environment?
So I'm hoping that Lobsang, if you can help us with this question. But what I want to say is, I have to admit that I really don't have a full understanding of this, how this initiative will directly impact Tibet. But what we do know is that a lot of development infrastructure, that China is focusing on right now, the damming projects, all these things are linked to Xi Jinping's, Belt and Road Initiative. These are being built to facilitate and to, support the Belt and Road Initiative. So yes, Lobsang, would you like to add more on that?
I think for me, I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is very recent Chinese government's economic development initiative, not only in Tibet, but as a whole. And I think when it talks about Belt and Road, I think for me, and there is like two narratives, two school of thought, where one school of thought says that, the Belt and Road Initiative will have a lot of impact on Tibet. And this will also, in the name of Belt and Road Initiative, there will be lots of infrastructure development, and that will not only impact the neighboring countries, but also the downstream nations. And when we look at Tibet with Nepal, and the Chinese are building up lots of roads and railway links, and from a strategic point of view, that will also have a geopolitical impact. But then I think the other school of thought where says that, when we look at the Chinese government's economic development, so which is called Western Development Campaign, which kind of, initiated in the early 2000s. And so this Western Development Campaign also includes the infrastructure development, the mining, the dam, and then, the economic relations. And then that also kind of, we see that, like all the infrastructure development comes under, the Western Development Campaign that they have already started in early 2000s. So it's like, it's like a bit confusing. And I feel that right now it's the initial phase, and we have much more to study and to see. But definitely, China is bringing lots of economic development. and economic development, especially at the border areas, and that also creates lots of nervous to India and to Nepal. But right now, Nepal and the Lhasa, the so-called Tibet Autonomous Region, seems to have a good the trading partner, and so I think we need to have a more study and more like patient, keen observation on that issue. I think this Belt and Road Initiative, the question has been also raised in the previous, during our first discussion on climate change, like on natural disaster as well. So on this, for the Belt and Road Initiative, Simon, do you have anything more to share on that, or we can go to the other question, last question?
No, nothing to build on on your two wisdom. Thank you.
Sure. So the final question is I think is very important, and this question is to both Kinzom and Simon. So when we look at Tibet, sometimes we tend to look Tibet as only a human rights issue, or Tibet as just seen as the environment issue. But can we, do we have a practical to address the Tibet problem, as it surely must be looked as a whole problem, rather than just the human rights or just the environment problem? So how can we address the Tibet problem as a whole by not looking just as a environment or human rights problem?
Simon, do you want to start first?
Sure, then you can have the last words. I think that's the absolute crux of what we've been, talking about today. The fact is that we have to look at these things as a whole. And as we've always said in different ways, environmental issues and human rights issues are very much two sides of the same coin. There's simply, I don't think, and I think we'd all agree, any way to get on top of the environmental challenges, the challenge of the climate crisis in Tibet or anywhere else, unless you have essential human rights, democratic freedoms, ability for people to determine their futures based on the way they've been able to live sustainably in the past. Unless you have all of that, we're not going to deal with these problems. The climate crisis is a human rights issue. And it's only through protection and upholding of human rights that we are going to find a pathway through this. So I think probably there's a clear picture there that I think we all agree on very strongly. I think the challenge when you say then finding practical solutions is, first of all, communicating that very effectively so that many more people grasp that essential truth. Because it is a more complicated kind of message than sometimes we're used to sort of pushing. And I think perhaps there is maybe no one single path then we pursue, but it means that we can work skillfully, whether it's in the context of UN climate negotiations, whether it's in a whole range of other kind of political opportunities. So we're playing to all those kind of dimensions of the Tibet issue, but always bringing it back to that one single story about how what works and is essential to ensure a secure, dignified, free future for Tibetan people are also the same things that's necessary to protect Tibet's environment, both for Tibetans, obviously, but for the wider world.
So yeah, just to add to that, I totally agree with just what Simon and both yourself, Lobsang, have mentioned about how it is. The problem in Tibet is not just a human rights problem, or it's not an environmental problem. We can't, it's everything. All these issues are related to one another. It is the great misfortune of Tibetans that, that we are having to deal with two very serious problems. One problem being very old, which is the problem of colonization, the Chinese occupation, and the other problem relatively new, let's say, climate change. So, but both these two issues are so inherently connected with one another that we can't really talk about one issue in isolation. And so it's important for us, when we try to talk about an environmental issue, we are able to talk about it in a political context, in a more holistic context, and try to kind of join the dots, and talk about, join the dots about why Tibet matters, to the global world, why the Tibetan people are suffering, and then being able to communicate that Tibetan people are not just the victims, that we are survivors, that we are fighters, and that and then being able to inspire the whole world to join our movement. So yes, I think we are living in very interesting times now. Politics, geopolitics, it's shifting every day, every week. It's the battle of who can win this battle of narratives or stories, who can tell a better story. And right now with the coronavirus situation, and especially related to the environment, there is a powerful story to tell, and story about how Chinese values, or what China is doing, what Chinese policies are not compatible with Tibetan values. In the whole coronavirus thing issue, we're talking about our environment. China's thinking is that man should conquer nature, whereas the Tibetan worldview is exactly the opposite. Tibetan nomads, Tibetan people is about protecting environment. It's about protecting our land. We may not have come from this kind of a Western environmental perspective, but we come from this, from a Buddhism worldview that, wildlife is to be protected. Environment is to be protected because it's where our deities live, it's where our water spirits reside, and it's because animals live in all these forests and all these grasslands. It's our responsibility as human beings to be compassionate towards other people and to be other sentient beings. Whereas the Chinese thinking, the Chinese government's worldview is entirely different. It's entirely incompatible with our worldview. So just as we are trying to address the human rights crisis, the climate crisis, I think fundamentally we have to work towards decolonizing Tibet, and only then can we achieve, I think, genuine freedom and genuine human rights. And I think right now it's an important time to tell a strong, powerful story about Tibet.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think, Kinzom, that's a very, the roadmap ahead for the Tibet issue. And you have clearly, and both the Simon and Kinzom, you have clearly shared a very, I would say, very clear vision for the Tibetans. And so I think here we would like to end our discussion, and thank you so much, Kinzom and Simon, for joining us, and your presentation, your view, your great work. And then that has been really helpful, very knowledgeable. And I'm sure, like, not only me, I'm sure that, all our viewers have really, it has been really helpful for all of us. And then we would be keeping this as a live record, and then it will be in our social media. And then later on, there will be more people watching it. And so thank you so much. And then I would also like to thank our viewers for, listening very patiently and asking lots of questions. In fact, there were so many questions, but then we couldn't take all the questions. So maybe I think in next month, then we will have more discussions on this very important topic. So here I would like to end, and thank you once again, Kinzom and Simon and all the viewers.
Thank
and,
you.
thank you. Now I would like to, now I would like to hand over to Mandy for the concluding remarks.
Thank you. That was an amazing discussion, and it went on for an hour and a half, which we weren't expecting. So thank you so much for staying up late, and thanks everyone for watching for so long. We really did have a wealth of more information that I think could have been shared, and there were certainly way too many questions for us to answer directly in the discussion, but we will reply to them on the Facebook page. So please do keep them coming in, and we will try and get as many answers to you as we can. As we said at the start, this is a series of talks, Tibet Climate Crisis talks. We have one more at the end of next week, which is part of our series for the month of April, and then we will be doing one monthly. However, there is another extra special one happening this Friday, which isn't organised by Tibet Network, but is organised by a group of Tibetan organisations based in Dharamsala, and if you look on the Facebook page, you'll be able to see that we will be broadcasting that again on Friday, and we have a special guest who is a scholar based in the US, a Tibetan academic, who will be giving a lot of information about nomad resettlement projects. It is going to be in Tibetan, so we will look to try and do the same one in English slightly later on. We will also be looking to do one, as Kingson was saying, on water and damming. We're going to be looking at one on Tibetan nomads. We're also going to be looking to do one with numerous frontline defender communities, so different indigenous communities as well, to have a discussion about how communities are dealing with climate crises in different areas, particularly in areas which are occupied or do not have a huge amount of say and ability to get the governments to do what they want them to do. So these will all be coming up shortly. I also wanted to very quickly touch on the two questions which in my mind are slightly linked, the one about the UN action and one about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I touch on it because we do some work with the Tibet Advocacy Coalition, who do a lot of work with the UN Human Rights Council, and there has been a briefing written recently about the Belt and Road Initiative and the impacts that it is going to have and is already having in Tibet, particularly on the nomadic communities with railways and roads being built. That is a UN briefing. We are going to be making that available. It will be on the website shortly, so people can see some answers to the questions that were raised and also the discussions that are being had with UN experts on the environment and on different issues kind of linked to the environment and linked to Tibet. Very quickly, I want to share my screen with you just to show you the website that we have developed. We shared it last week, so you could see there's a whole host of information on this site. You can, just moving my screen over, you can find different information about the climate crisis, nomad resettlement, water issues. There are videos, there's information about our talks. I really wanted to show the Take Action page. There are some actions that are being done as part of the climate strikes. Tibet groups are urging people to take as much action as possible, specifically on the Tibet climate crisis, linked to the Friday climate strikes, obviously at home at the moment, but when they come back out onto the streets also to be joining. I really wanted to show you that there are a number of petitions. So there's one about Tibetan nomads, which is urging the Human Rights Commissioner to ensure that when she goes on a visit to China, she goes to Tibet, but not just goes to Tibet, she goes and visits Tibetan nomad areas and meets with Tibetan nomads and talks about the resettlement program. There's one on damming, and there is one on the environment, the Tibetan environment activist, Anya Sendra, who was raised by both Kheenzum and Lobsang. Anya Sendra is a Tibetan nomad. He worked really, really hard in his community on a number of issues. He worked to raise the issue of what's happening with mining in the areas that he lives in, and he did a huge amount about anti-corruption, and anti-corruption specifically linked to how Tibetan nomads who had been resettled were not getting the provisions that they needed. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison for this human rights defender work that he was carrying out. And he is appealing against that sentence. And we just found out yesterday that his appeal will take place on Monday the 27th of April. Tibet groups around the world are doing work now to highlight his case with governments, to make sure that China know that we are watching when this appeal takes place, and we are urging that they do not re-sentence him and that he is released because he is entirely innocent. I urge you to go to the Take Action page and to sign the petition for his release, so that we can really, really ramp up that, you know, we are watching and we know this is happening. So please do that. And lastly, I just wanted to show you, there are Tibet groups around the world working on not just Tibetan freedom work, though this is, as we've said, this is all linked together, but there are groups that are doing a huge amount of work on Tibet's environment. And on the Who We Are page of the TibetClimateCrisis.org site, you can scroll down and see a whole list of different groups that are doing specific environment work. So for instance, here is Visit Australia Tibet Council, the organisation that Kheenzum works for. You can go there, click on the button, and you can find out exactly what your local Tibet organisation is doing, and you can join them and you can take actions with them directly. So we do urge you also to do that. And that's it. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. A huge thank you again to Lobsang, Kheenzum and Simon for joining us. It was a great discussion, and I hope that you come back and talk to us again at another time.
Thank you,
Thank
Mandy.
you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.